How are you?
Yeah,
Nice
well,
to see you. We're just getting one remote participant connected, and then we'll begin. While we're doing that, since we have a number of guests today, in our usual fashion, perhaps we could just briefly go around the room. President Royal, how are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
Good. This is JD. You can hear us okay?
I can.
Fantastic. Well, we were just getting started, and we were going to do some introductions. We have our guest presenters here with us, as well as a number of other guests. And so everybody knows each other. Perhaps we can just briefly go around the room. Christina, why don't you start?
I'm Christina Royal, president of Holyoke Community College.
Jim Pfizer, Secretary of Education.
Hi, I'm Jean Eddy, president of American Students.
Hi, Michael Horn, founder of the Clayton Christensen Institute.
Michelle Weiss from Strata Education Network.
Marjorie Ringrose from the Smith Family Foundation.
Evan Zerbe, president of America from Salem State University.
Joe Fuller from Harvard Business School.
Sanjay Sharma from MIT.
Don Kilburn, CEO of UMass Online.
David Mishner, sociologist.
And Oswanda, our partners healthcare.
Jennifer Davis here, Mr. Education, Collaborative.
Why don't we have our presenters please introduce themselves?
Sure. Michelle Carroll, I'm the Director of Employment at Duet.
Mike Lassen, President Duet.
I'm Kimberly Stefan with Western Governors University as the Chancellor of WGU Tennessee.
Chris Bennell, Western Governors University.
Hi, I'm Anand Agarwal. I'm CEO of edX and also a professor at MIT.
Hi, I'm Guru Dev.
Todd Hitchcock at the University of Mass Online.
Great. And let me also acknowledge the many members of the Commonwealth Corporation team here today. We have a pretty packed agenda, so I'd like to begin by just giving an overview of the structure of today's meeting, and then a brief review of where we've gotten to so far. So we're going to take about 30 minutes to discuss the white paper describing a system of lifelong learning that was provided in your packets, and from there spend a little bit of time talking about the committee structure, which will provide the basis for our commission's work over the summer. And I'll say more about both of those in a little while. The second half of our meeting will be devoted to the presentations from our guests, and it will work thusly. Those of you who have indicated that you'd like to attend the UMass Online and Duet presentations should stay here. And those of you who have indicated that you'd like to attend the WGU and Duet presentations, Rebecca Lashman, my colleague, who's raising her hand, will lead you to the 5th floor conference room where those presentations will take place. And my other colleague, Raya, will escort the presenters a little bit ahead of that so you can get fully set up. Any questions about that? Thank you.
Can we come back after the presentation?
We do not come back, so we will have to bring it to a nice closure before that, and yeah, and then just sort of leave it mysterious. So that's that. In terms of goals for today's meeting, here's what I'm hoping we can achieve. First of all, the white paper provides some thoughts for discussion on what a system of lifelong learning could look like and what the roles and functions of a system actor could be. And I'm hoping that in our discussion, we can say what we liked about that, what we didn't like, what was missing, what we would add to it in order to enrich what is put on paper so far. As I said last time, the broad way in which we're working is for us to have a good discussion, for us as the project team to sort of take it all in and try to give it back to you in the next meeting in a way that reflects the discussion in an authentic way. I'm hoping that we can achieve a clarity in how we'll proceed over the summer in the work of our 3 working committees. One focused on further explicating a system of lifelong learning, another focused on the programmatic aspects of lifelong learning, and third, institutional partners who would be involved in that kind of work and what exactly would they do. And in terms of the presentations, as you know, We provided some questions in advance to the presenters that are tied to the major themes that have come up in our discussion so far. And we're hoping that in addition to hearing their presentations, you can have a good discussion with them as well. So that's that. Any questions about that? Thank you. So let me just take a brief moment to review where we've gotten thus far. We've spent some time in our first couple of meetings talking about who we're trying to help on this commission and what sectors of the economy, what industries we're trying to focus on. And I thought I'd try to capture here some of the salient points. I wouldn't say that we are unanimous in this regard, but there seems to be a high degree of interest that in terms of the learner population of interest, we're most interested in scoping a population that would be workers in jobs with an opportunity pathway, your entry-level worker, but your worker who needs more education in order to take the next steps, as well as your workers in jobs with less of a structured pathway, or maybe no opportunity pathway, who also need something more in order to advance in work in their lives. We're primarily interested in adult learners, but we do want to scope this so that we encompass what I would call the older portion of the opportunity youth population, those not in school or not in work. And in terms of attainment, we're interested in the some college, no degree population, as well as the no college population. So that provides some sense of the parameters of the learners we'd like to serve in our efforts. In terms of the employment sectors of interest, last time, as you'll recall, we talked about healthcare, manufacturing, and information technology. IT is applied broadly across industries, recognizing that it's a component of almost every industry nowadays. We talked about the necessity of aligning what we do here on this commission with the governor's skills cabinet and its priorities, which track these sectors, and that our efforts should be connected to and informed by the governor's regional planning process. So that's something to keep in the back of our minds. And we haven't talked about it that much here in our commission room, but in our individual conversations, we've certainly talked about what we think are interesting elements of a potential conceptual model for lifelong learning. And again, this goes back to some of the discussion that began at the governor's convening back in the fall. We talked about our interest in credit for prior learning and trying to help learners get credit for all sorts of things that they've done on the job in their lives and prior schooling experiences. This being a digital innovation commission, we've talked about online competency-based learning as the instructional core. We've talked about what we think is probably a necessity to have a robust student support and coaching mechanism, and indeed we've talked with our presenters today about what it is they've done in that regard, knowing that that is key to learner success in a digitally enabled environment oftentimes. We've talked about soft skills development and the potential need to have something more organized and emphatic as we model out what a lifelong learning experience could be in Massachusetts. And finally, we've talked about experiential learning and the possibilities that could hold. So as we move forward, I'd like for us to continue to have this in the back of our minds as potential starting points for the modeling out of the learner experience that we're trying to build. Let me stop there and ask if there are any questions or comments. Hopefully this is just a refresher and not brand new. Okay. So with that, I'd like to turn to the white paper and get your comments on that. I've put up here a summary of some salient points. When we have talked about building a system of lifelong learning, the basic idea is very simple. It's simply that you're up here with me. Welcome. The idea is very simply that that having some organized activity would be a good way to take advantage of all these innovations that we're seeing, all these new enterprises, and begin to cohere them in a way that would allow us to get some real lift. And this is a rough organizational schema, but I sort of thought about what a lifelong learning system could do and what a system actor could do in three broad categories. Number one, serving as a connector. Number two, serving as an enabler. And number three, serving as a translator. And let me take a moment to explain. You'll see these points reflected on pages 3 and 4 of the white paper. In terms of connector, we want to build greater connectivity and communion between education and training providers and employers. We know that education and training providers do a lot already, but yet we still have a skills gap that concerns us. So the role of a system actor in trying to get to the next level of depth in the employer relationship seems like something that could be an interesting area of focus. Thinking about the notion of a system of lifelong learning, it makes sense to think about how a system actor would connect back to the other parts of the education ecosystem that already exist, higher education and K-12 systems. We've talked a little bit about that as we've discussed. Now, how is it that younger people become aware of the job opportunities that are available? How would we make them aware of the types of new learning opportunities that are coming into the market? So a system actor having an organized way of connecting back to K-12 and higher education systems might be a good thing to do. There's also policy implications, financial resources, both for providers and for learners. How ought financial aid resources be put to the task of supporting new ways of providing lifelong learning to people? That is something that a system actor could provide insight about. Moving on to the second category, enabler. Here I've sort of organized some of the points from the paper that speak to what a system actor could do for the learner. So we know that our population of learners are not always people who have a lot of natural opportunity in their lives. So providing information, coaching, advice about the cornucopia of options that are available might be something that a system actor could helpfully do. Similarly, connecting learners to important support resources, be they public benefits of certain types, as we often do at Commonwealth Corporation and its work, or more straightforward things like financial aid. And I think a system actor might play a particularly important role in assuring that parts of the market that wouldn't naturally be served by the naturally operating market do get served. We've talked in this room about English language learners. We've talked in this room about opportunity groups. How can we assure that lifelong learning opportunities provide real opportunity for those populations as well as many others? Here, the role of a system actor could be helpful. And then finally, a translator. We've talked about the need for a common language, a common taxonomy of skills and competencies and credentials. And even more simply than that, just a common language between educators and training providers and employers about what they do and how they do it and what they're trying to achieve around competencies. An organized player that really helps make those links and helps provide that translation could be productive. Identifying and addressing policy and regulatory barriers would be something a system actor could do. And then finally, gathering information both for learners and for entities, providers, on market intelligence, program quality, getting a sense of outcomes, what players are doing good work, where can different players learn from each other. That's also something that a system actor can do. So those are just some thoughts about how we might put some structure around the idea of lifelong learning in Massachusetts and a system actor. And I'd open it up for your comments and discussion.
One thing I think is often missing in systems is an active propagator of best practices. It's been implicit in the enabler category, but you see time and again nationwide that Chattanooga is doing great stuff, and Memphis is in the water, and no one in Memphis is talking to big Chattanooga.
Why do you think that happens?
Well, part of it, of course, is that when K through 12 is heavily involved and you've got the organization of that system, very often innovative efforts also hinge on having this synergy of engaged leaders. You'll have a governor like Haslam who decides this is a big part of what he wants to be about. You've got employers in Chattanooga like Siemens and VW, steeped in the apprenticeship system, anxious to try to help the community meet the standards we're setting. You've got, in that case, a very active regional economic development organization. But there's several, the secret sauce is made by several chefs at once, and if you don't have all of them, it doesn't seem to come together, and often when one drops out of the system, things start to grind to a halt.
Great. Other points to add, Michael?
Yeah, I guess.
I would like to add something.
Christina, please go ahead.
I do apologize, the connection is doing bad, so I'm having difficulty hearing you guys. But I did want to share a couple of thoughts that I have on the concept paper. One is there was a piece in the on page 3 that talked about generating a common taxonomy, which I very much agree with, but I would like to suggest that maybe we need to even take a step beyond that in looking at an infrastructure for accessing and managing these taxonomies, because the right now in the concept of a degree or certificate, they're packaged in a way that produces a set of competencies or taxonomies as opposed to singular. And if we had an infrastructure that boiled it down to the singular taxonomies, and there was a mechanism, sort of like it could be a LinkedIn, matchmaking, et cetera, like a lot of different ways that things could be filtered, then employers would be able to seek the talent that they want at a level that is not at the degree level, which kind of gets us onto the micro learning as well. I also wanted to share sort of a thought about even changing the paradigm through which we have this conversation. What if the prospective students came through the employer's door rather than the education door first? So right now, not to say that there aren't situations where they come through the employer door first, but for the most part, they come to the college, they explore what they want to do, they enroll in a degree pathway program, and then we say, okay, look for a job. What if they actually came through the employer door first in identifying prospective talent, and then then were directed to education? I'm not suggesting a complete overhaul of the higher education system. That would be out of scope for us. But just in general, that is something for us to think about. Also, that there's an opportunity to look at putting the career centers on college campuses and moving that experience of career advising to the front end rather than the back end of the college experience. And then also just a need to focus on the quality of the delivery modes and flexibility. Even just, for example, this is a digital commission, and the quality of this experience, me with you with me, it's limited because of the technology set up and structure. And so, to be able to facilitate better opportunities for high quality learning at a distance will also help with flexible learning.
Thank you for that. I want to get to your point, Michael, but I'm curious to ask you, Christina. I mean, what you said about the entry point being the company and not the school is a really important point. And when we were blocking out on that table there in the white paper about how a system would be the same and different, we kind of noted that idea that the locus of activity would be the company. I'm curious, Christina, if you've seen any examples of entities that have sort of recognized that reality of how an adult learner or working learner would connect through the company, and how we might do that in a more than a one-off way, in a more systematized way. Any thoughts?
Well, a lot of times this is the model for workforce education in various entities, particularly a lot of community colleges. So, yeah, on the workforce side, you work with an employer, you identify a need, and let's say the employer and they have tuition reimbursement and they're willing to really support the growth of that individual or individuals. They're making that upfront investment in them because of the return on investment in terms of their employment there. And so it does happen through that, but the default in our society is that people go first to identify their educational pathways, and then they identify their job prospects. And so I'm kind of suggesting that maybe we take a little deeper dive at what we could do and under what employment conditions. So I don't see this as a model, for example, that you have a lot of mom and pop shops, but certainly starting with big employers that are vested through a tuition reimbursement is a good subset to explore this on a greater level. Because we go and we work with them and say, tell us what your needs are, and we customize that to a certain degree for that employer. So even if it's a standard degree or certificate program, there's still an element of bringing in what's important to the employer and doing it on site at their job, for example, and a lot of things that allow us to tailor it to an employer's needs. But culturally in our society, that's not the model that we have. So it might be worth us taking a look at that in a deeper way.
Thank you.
Yeah, my thought was that there's a lot to like about this in theory, and I guess my concern is that when it's reality, does it over-index on being an orchestrator of all these players as opposed to an enabler of conditions that allow these sorts of interactions to thrive? And you have the word enabler up there. I guess I was thinking more though of enabler of conditions as opposed to an enabler of certain relationships. For example, provide information, coaching, advice to learners could be a very important part of the solution for an individual college or university, like Northeastern we know is developing tools around that, for example. A second piece is in terms of the common taxonomy. I think that can work in certain functions. I worry as you get it more into the bleeding edge, we're actually not going to understand what those are, and those can be the source of proprietary advantage in certain cases for both educational institutions and firms. And so being mindful around how standards actually evolve and sort of interdependence, or when there's unpredictable interdependence versus when they're well understood, I think is going to be important. So just being careful to not come across as too omniscient in all this.
Yeah, no, it's the point's well taken. So you're more in favor of a system actor being an enabler of conditions as opposed to relationships,
correct?
Or at least assuming too much in terms of the orchestration.
Yeah, I think that's right, because I love connecting and convening, right? I think that's an important function that, I don't know, it's a system. I think that's an important function to help bring people together. But I worry about, exactly what you said.
Thank you, Mary.
Just a couple of points. One is when I read this white paper and I read this system actor responsibilities, I felt like I was sort of reading my job description. I do think the local level with and creative and made as much of this already. We've done quite a bit of it in the manufacturing world so far, and in healthcare, sometimes moved to IT as so I think at the local level, a lot of this is happening through the workforce. Sometimes better than others. give them those skills. And that hopefully will result in college credits eventually and allow the folks at the work site to again enter this lifelong learning through the employer rather than through the school. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much. And it's probably worth just saying the obvious points that you make once more, which is that you look at this and you can say, we have this. It's called the job training system, and there you are. So I think your point raises a couple of interesting questions to explore. One is, what can be leveraged from the workforce system in the service of a lifelong learning system? And what we're really talking about here is the merger of the higher education conversation and the workforce conversation. A growing number of players who identify as higher education and not job training, but in actuality are doing things that are very, very much could be in either zone. And bringing that activity and those players together in a slightly more organized way, but not an overly deterministic way, to your point, could be a way to both achieve some further goals in the higher education space and serve the type of broader economic goals that we already seek to serve in the workforce development space. Does that make sense?
And also learning to do it better. Learning to understand the system and how one responds and reacts to this type of really change.
Michelle.
I was wondering if we could just chat a little bit about this notion of system actor, because that sort of seems surprising to me, kind of reading through the white paper and then kind of getting to this, it's almost like a singular system actor, because the way that I sort of envision a lifelong learning mechanism, it's going to be some sort of ecosystem approach, right? And so I don't necessarily see like a central system actor. I don't know, I'd love to kind of hear people's thoughts on this, versus thinking about the conditions and sort of most importantly the barriers. Like I think there's a bullet on barriers, but I feel like that is probably the biggest enabler in terms of identifying what are the things that get in the way, especially regulatory barriers. Think about Pell Grants, think about their financial aid in service of workforce development, in service of adult learners returning frequently to learning experience. There's so much that would make this impossible, even though in theory it sounds great. So I almost feel like we can't talk about enabling without really sort of focusing on the conditions and the barriers and who are the actual actors who we need to kind of bring to the table to actually undo some of those barriers. I feel like that is, a sort of precondition to all of this that maybe we don't focus enough on. But I'd love to just sort of hear people's thoughts on this notion of a system actor within this ecosystem and whether that is kind of how you were thinking about it, or I don't know, it just seemed kind of surprising to me when I got to that point.
Thoughts?
Judy?
Yeah.
So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we don't want to necessarily create this beautifully architected, complex system, manager, especially in the context of a very inchoate market, right? This is very dynamic. It's still in its early stages. Nonetheless, I think trying to think about how to catalyze the work in this domain, in this place, because this is, we're in Massachusetts, this is a place-based strategy we're talking about as opposed to a market-building strategy. How to make Massachusetts not just a place where there are some providers, some actors, some entrepreneurs who are doing really interesting things that may be having broad impact, if not global impact, but how do we sort of create a critical mass of activity that is not only in state, but not only located in the state, but serving residents of the state. And that's where some of these components may be necessary in order to create the kind of critical mass of activity that's locally focused. So that's the thing I'm struggling with is what's the sweet spot? Because we're not talking about organizing the marketplace for digital learning. We're talking about catalyzing the Massachusetts marketplace for digital learning and creating incentives for people to invest here, for organizations to develop both their own presence here, but to educate and work with our residents. How do we create that kind of ecosystem that's very kind of locally focused? And that may require a little bit more hands-on engagement than might otherwise be the case if we were thinking more broadly about a market that is going to develop in ways that we don't necessarily want to predetermine, at least from a geographic point.
I'd go off the cue solely focusing on outcomes, but it does seem to me that another test here is to actually see what kind of outcomes, measurable outcomes you're trying to get out of this activity, and are those realistic as you match up to what you're trying to do here? And because then you have a milestone, you can actually probably test that pretty easily. So, well, that's not really realistic to get that goal for this mechanism. Maybe it is realistic in other things.
As you've read through this and thought about it, do some key outcomes spring forward in your mind?
Well, if you want to get more degree completers, set a goal for that. If you want to have more job X, get more people involved in that. If you want to have more corporations participate, set a goal for that. These are all things you can measure. And it might be clarifying in terms of mission as well.
Other comments? I'd like to take a stab at the question about the system actor. So I take your point very, very well, and I guess I've sort of been inspired a little bit by the way Commonwealth Corporation acts. So we're an organization with a public-private construct. We don't seek to direct, but we provide opportunities, right? We provide through the administration of things like the Workforce Training Fund, provide opportunities for entities that want to engage in training that's strategic for them and for the state to do so. Having an organized program of work around that, is useful. As we sort of noted in the white paper, one of the distinctive differentiators of this system is that so many of the players are private players. And so architecting a sort of publicly dominated system doesn't seem to be the right move here. But having a player who sort of sits in the midst of it all, I wouldn't say at the center, but in the midst of it all, providing opportunities that can help market players, that can provide information to learners, and maybe is also knowledgeable enough about the policy conversation, which is a space where a lot of the barriers often come up, and has standing to do something in that conversation could be a useful help. So I've thought a lot about this very question myself, and asked, like, what are we after here? Are we looking for a command and control? And I think the answer is pretty clearly no, if I'm taking the pulse of the room correctly. It's a coordinating entity of some kind, but the degree of coordination we need to tune appropriately to the players in the market. And we need to be mindful of the fact that those players are pretty different from the types of players that we might see in other types of coordinating boards or similar entities that I can think of, like, say, our Department of Higher Education. So all I can say at this point is being sensitive to the dynamic you raised is quite important.
You provide opportunities. Can you illustrate what you provide?
Well, yeah, I can, I'm going to spend the taxpayers' money like rent, so just bear that in mind, Jen. But I can imagine a state-supported program that aligns opportunities for market players to do programs of one kind or another that are in tune with the skills cabinet strategy, right? That's not a far cry, actually, again, from the type of thing that we do at Commonwealth Corporation already. I can imagine an organized program of work that is directed at opportunity youth that either educates them on the types of lifelong learning that might be available to them, or provides maybe some subsidized steps into a lifelong learning experience. I could go on and on, but those are a couple examples. I can think of ways that it's Commonwealth Corporation, we have Signal Success, soft skills curriculum. I can think of ways to leverage that in the service of some of the models, the elements of the model that we're thinking about here. So,
there is that. I believe that some entity that either identify and remove barriers, receive input about barriers, help them be helpful. I think the closer something is provided by catalyst to market interactions between employers, skills providers, whether it's workforce or educators, and gives great transparency of marketplaces to job seekers, but the more it becomes a principal party in that transaction, as opposed to the more suspicious I am, doesn't mean it couldn't convince me, but I start getting closer and closer to we're going to pick the winners and define the curriculum and a different version where something's not available.
I got you. And that's let me give you another example. So, recently Commonwealth Corporation was asked to lead an industry panel that's going to come together around healthcare. And this comes out of some of the skills cabinet work, some work that was done by PCG on behalf of the governor. And I've been thinking to myself, how would you, so we have this situation where you have your post-secondary institutions and their employer boards, their advisory boards, all the structures that currently exist. And they're not, they get you to a certain point, but we know that there's more further that we need to get. So I asked myself, how could a body like this be attuned to building the type of deeper connection that we seem to need in a lifelong learning mode? As we organize a program of work around, Commonwealth Corporation's interaction with this board that is coming together, can we say, well, we would like to explicitly, Commonwealth is going to focus more on lifelong learning. We'd like to really think through what that means in practical terms with you. Let's have a deeper conversation about what the nuts and bolts of that looks like in terms of key jobs and key competencies of key companies. Maybe you populate the body with certain companies who can really speak to that in line with, I think, who was saying that about key companies, I forget. But you get the point. So that would be one way that is not about, someone making decisions about money that inevitably gets to picking winners and losers, but rather a different and new organizational framework that just creates an opportunity to work in new ways. Because, what I think happens oftentimes is that even the best intentioned people fall victim to sort of the institutional ossification that allows people to take a step and then just sort of find themselves being pulled back by the undertow. So the opportunity here is to create something new and design it new and distinctive ways so that you are not burdened by past ways of working or past culture.
If it were to be new, I'd love to have the capability to launch tests and learn from them as opposed to launch pilots, stick with them in perpetuity. So it'd be a new type of organization if we were on Paris data for good testing and learning and shutting down a bunch of things that didn't have good results and moving fast on things.
So, fascinating conversation. Selfishly thinking about the employer's role in all of this, and I think the more connected it is throughout the discussion, the better it is. When the rubber meets the road, sometimes changes pretty rapidly for the employer. So, I think it behooves us to think about the voices at the table, to really have a lens on the business side and what's driving, what are some of the pain points, and where we're struggling to hire folks, and thinking ahead like 3 or 5 years, I think would be helpful. We could go down a path of creating programs and initiatives that at the moment sound really solid, and there's an opportunity here. I can see already from the person on the phone that said, could it be referrals from the employer side, or does it come to the employer from the external side? So having that voice at the table, I think, will be really important. Some of the discussion that we just offered is very vibrant in our workforce development work internally to us, and we're always thinking about where the gaps are and how we partner with different educational systems. We can't do it all, be it all, but we have a real foundation that I think is of value to say, here's what we see, and where the gaps are for us. It's striking to me that we see folks that are not employed, that we're not offering the better tools, and that we're still struggling to fill these jobs. It really does. I think there's a connection there I can't quite figure out by myself, but it's helpful to think about that as you're thinking about this new organization that's coming together.
One last comment, and I think this is actually a great segue into the discussion about the committees.
I think what I'm just sort of sussing out through this conversation is that we're conflating two things, it seems. Like, I think we're talking about a system actor, which seems to have connotations of more agency and also potentially like a gatekeeper and a picker of winners and losers, which I think we're not so excited about, versus like a platform play, versus like something that is agnostic and is creating a marketplace where all these pieces can come together. The thing, Secretary Fletcher, that kind of makes me wonder about sort of this idea of a place-based thing as being different from a national thing is that there are so many entrepreneurs and creative solutions that are being built to address so many of these problems. Challenges are mass-based employers and some of our institutions aren't necessarily aware of all of those solutions. I think we're trying to get to some of them today, but there's way more, especially in each of those little bullets. And so to have a place where all of that is there, a singular platform where any learner can go to it or any employer can go to it, I think that makes sense. But I don't necessarily see the national play somehow being in conflict with the place-based, like a mass solution.
But what you're talking about then is a system actor who's focused more on the student and the employer rather than the providers or the entrepreneurs, which that may be the right way of thinking.
Potentially. I mean, I think it's all in there. I think we, as we're thinking about connecting learners to more information, transparency, outcomes data, you can imagine how there is this sort of consumer insights piece to it where people are talking about how that program, got them to where they wanted to go. There's this exchange going on. So I don't know. Just to say, I think that's what we're talking. We're talking about two slightly different things in one.
In some ways, I would go back to Don's point to bring your 2 points together in that, we are trying to create something for the benefit of Massachusetts, right? To elevate Massachusetts and its people further, to elevate its economy further. And so all of that kind of does roll up at some point into us deciding that there are some concrete goals around that. Now we've been running this commission in sort of an inductive way, right? Trying to have the conversation and through our consensus build things and build up to that, I think. But that's a way to, I think you're right. So I think that what's pretty clear is that we are not interested in the Massachusetts Department of Lifelong Learning. But what exactly is the right modulation, sort of beyond that, is something that we have yet to figure out. And that brings me to the working committees. So in many ways, this is great, and I appreciate the conversation because it's a good window into how we might carry the conversation forward over the summer. So I'm going to ask you to, in a few minutes, to fill out a sheet where you will indicate which committees you'd like to be on. But you read the description in your packet, but just to go over what it is that how we've set this up. And we talked about this a little bit last time. We've got committee number 1, which will continue to build out the conceptual model for a quote-unquote system of lifelong learning. So, what is the institutional structure? What are the ways in which it works? What are some key goals? That's the what and the why committee. And these are not mutually exclusive, and I'll say a little bit more about this, but that's fundamentally what committee number 1 would do. Number 2 is the programmatic aspects, the how committee. You'll recall the slide with all the rectangles, the conceptual model of what the lifelong learning experience could be. Committee number 2 will be asked to drill down on that. These elements that we've identified for now, are they the right elements? Are there other elements we want to bring in? Is the gradation, the emphasis on one element as opposed to another, the right fit? Is it too much? Is it overbuilt? Committee 2 will be working on that. And then number 3 is the Institutional Partners Committee. We lost her. Thank you. That was planned. Christina could only join till 4. Is the institutional partners really an invitation to us around the table to figure out how our institutions, workforce boards, institutions of higher education, community colleges, might specifically plug into both the conceptual vision and the operational work. So let me just pause and ask if that is clear, or if you have questions. Clear enough?
I do wonder about the, under how, I assume we would be discussing financial resources, or how we.
That's a great question. I think on some level, it's an element of both 1 and 2. But it's certainly an element of 2.
I mean, decades ago, centuries ago, we decided that education is only mandated to 8. And now we're saying, no way, and ever, right? Because it's lifelong. So we have free public education right now till actually age 22 when you think about students with special needs, and then there's K, and then public school system. But after that, even worse somehow. Sometimes through financial aid, sometimes through state line items, for the colleges, etc. But this, when I read the white paper, I was wondering in the back of my mind, so this is expensive, and somehow, how to pay, not who it out.
So the issue of cost plays into a couple of dimensions, and I would say this: I don't think it's possible, nor should we try to figure out all the intricate dimensions here for the purposes of the report that we're submitting to the governor. However, it might be useful to signal at areas where we think that there's promise. So a couple thoughts. We already know that there are operations like guild education that are figuring out ways to take advantage of tuition benefits, employee benefits. We've already talked about that at our meetings here, about how Partners does that and uses that in the collaboration with College for America. So giving some sense in our final report of opportunities like that would be good. I personally believe that it might be interesting to think about things like our state student aid system and how it might be recalibrated. I would not imagine that it is our charge to propose a wholesale reform, but to speak to how what we're talking about aligns with that at a time when the Board of Higher Education is also entering a conversation into that might be apropos. Thinking about policy changes at the federal level, building on the experimental flexibility that has enabled things like the CFA model to be funded through Title IV aid, and maybe putting a stake in the ground around further federal policy measures that would be good to help our state and other states build on this would be good. But, we figure it all out? I'm not so sure.
I think JD finding, having an explicit discussion with you, which I did was my first choice of group, so I'm passing this off to you, is how do you unleash private sector financial resources to greatly accelerate innovation in this space, whether that's by encouraging companies to rethink the way they have to spend in creating hiring, to how you create an environment in Massachusetts that's highly attractive to entrepreneurs in the space. Because there's so many traffic economics in the system that there continue to be lots of opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Yes.
I was just going to add to that you already mentioned that JD, these aren't mutually exclusive, they are overlapping. And I see the Blue Committee, the institutional partners very much addressing what you were just raising as to what are the sources within the partner groups that can provide some resources.
And just to comment briefly on the Blue Committee, and then I'll move us along in the interest of time. You know, we started out on this commission with the belief that this is not a zero-sum game, that there's a big market of potential learners, and that everyone around this table who represents one institution or another can play a productive role. So I really want to embrace that spirit of our work and utilize this committee as a place where we can really figure out what that means. So if you open up your binders, you will find this sheet. And I would ask you to take a moment right now to rank order which committee you'd like to be on. So please put your name on the sheet, and then rank them 1, 2, and 3, and then just pass them on to the side. And if you're interested in serving as a chair of the committee, please indicate that as well.
What does that involve, Katie?
Just to work closely with our project team to construct conversations in a authentic way.
A question about committee one is how much more do you want to build upon what you already developed here?
I mean, on the basis of today's conversation, I'd say we need to build further, right? Where we may need to change some things. So it's in that spirit. So what we'll do is we'll have an organizational kickoff call of the committees in early July. As you know from the schedule in the front of your binders, we have 2 committee meetings in mind, July 31st and August 28th. We'll provide some opportunity at the midpoint, say like early August, to share out, for us to share out among the committees, so that you have a sense of what each committee is working on. And then our hope is that each committee can be guided to create a deliverable of some kind that would really form the agenda of our September 25th meeting. And as you think about it, as you think about concepts, what the experience is, and how the players fit in, you can also see how this feeds quite naturally into a structure for our final report for the government. So thank you very much for our discussion today. And let me once again ask those who are staying for the UMass and online and edX presentation to remain here. And Rebecca will lead the rest of you down to the 5th floor for the other presentations. Thank you.